Hey guys. Tonight, we slip into the crackling cold of a battlefield where men stand shoulder-to-shoulder muskets at the ready, a line of humanity bracing against the smoke of black powder. You can almost taste the sulfur in the air, sharp and metallic as volleys crackle like rolling thunder. The ground beneath your boots is soft with churned mud, the smell of trampled grass rising like some desperate perfume of survival. You watch as the line of red, blue, or gray uniforms stretches into the haze, and you wonder, why would anyone choose to fight this way? Why would soldiers simply line up, stand tall, and fire until either they or their enemies collapsed in heaps? It feels suicidal. And you're right, you probably won't survive this. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is for you right now. I love seeing people from every corner of the world chiming in. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You're standing there, heart pounding, musket shaking in your sweaty hands. Around you are men who look just as terrified as you feel. The officers bark orders and you shuffle into line. Your right shoulder brushes against your comrade's sleeve. Your left elbow nearly bumps another. Tight spacing, almost no room to breathe. And then you realize this is the point. The line isn't just a way of fighting. It's a way of binding terrified individuals into a single body. Alone, you'd probably scatter the moment a cavalry charge comes thundering down. But in this line, with muskets leveled and comrades shoulder to shoulder, you become something larger. The smoke swirls, blinding you more than the enemy does. One musket shot makes little difference. A musket ball fired at 50 yards might miss a man entirely. It might even wobble away and land harmlessly in the mud. But put 100 muskets together, fire them all at once, and suddenly that haze of lead becomes a storm that no one can ignore. Historians still argue whether commanders really trusted the accuracy of their men or simply trusted the law of averages. Enough lead in the air and you'll hit something. The truth probably lies somewhere between both. The air is thick with the rhythm of command. You hear the officer shout, "Make ready, present fire," and the crash of muskets is so loud it stuns your ears. The kick of the weapon nearly cracks your shoulder. A puff of smoke blinds your vision. And yet, you feel strangely calm. Everyone is doing the same thing. The line itself is like a spine, you a single vertebra in a creature stretching across the field. Of course, you know the danger. You know that standing in line also means you're standing fully exposed. There's no tree trunk to duck behind, no stone wall to crouch under. Just open ground, your chest facing the enemy, waiting for their volley to answer yours. But here's the strange comfort: if you go down the line, closes up. If someone else falls, you step forward into their place. The formation swallows death like a wave and rolls on. A curious thought slips in as you glance across the field. Your enemy looks just like you. Their line mirrors yours, maybe wearing different colored coats, but the effect is the same. Men line shoulder-to-shoulder, muskets raised, waiting for the signal. It's like two mirrors facing one another, endless repetition of the same image doomed to shatter when steel finally meets flesh. You wonder, not for the first time, whether this entire ritual is more theater than warfare. Historians still argue whether these lines were as effective as generals claimed, or if they were just a way to keep panicked peasants under control. And yet, order matters. You look around and see banners, fluttering drums, beating officers, waving swords. In the fog of war, when smoke rolls like a blanket across the ground, these signals are the only way to guide thousands of men at once. Without them, it would all dissolve into chaos, and you'd be nothing more than frightened farmers with guns. The line, rigid and almost absurd, becomes a lifeline for command. There's a fringe detail you can't help noticing. Some of the men around you have stuffed bits of paper cloth, even grass, into their ears to muffle the thunder of musket fire. The constant volleys are deafening, leaving soldiers with ringing in their heads that lasted days, sometimes weeks. Nobody thought much of it at the time, it was just part of the job. Funny to think that men in the 18th century might have invented improvised earplugs before anyone realized hearing loss was permanent. As you squint into the haze, you think of something you overheard in camp last night. We're not really aiming at men. We're aiming at the enemy line. That's the brutal logic. You don't pick a face. You don't even see a face. You aim at the stripe of color, the blurred wall of figures, and you let the musket speak for you. It's less about the individual and more about crushing the formation itself. The enemy line wavers, bends, and if you're lucky, it breaks. Still, you can't shake the fear of what happens when the enemy gets too close. If the line falters, if the volley mistimes, cavalry will pour in like wolves into a sheep pen. And you know what that means: sabers flashing, horses rearing the line shattered into desperate fragments. That's why you cling so tightly to your spot. That's why even though your knees tremble, you don't break. The line is safety. The line is survival. You remember something an old sergeant told you while cleaning his bayonet by firelight? Son, one man alone is meat. A line of men together is iron. You didn't understand it then, but now, shoulder pressed against your comrades, you get it. The line isn't just a tactic, it's a transformation. It makes men into metal, at least for a while. And then the command comes again. The cycle repeats. You bite the cartridge, pour powder, ram the ball, raise the weapon. The ritual becomes almost soothing, like a grim dance step you've learned by heart. Fire, reload, fire again. The smoke is so thick now you can't see the enemy, only flashes of orange flame lighting up the gloom. Somewhere in there, men are falling. Maybe you'll be next, but right now in this frozen field of muskets, you are part of the line. You shuffle forward through mud and smoke, musket heavy in your grip, and the air carries the sharp tang of sulfur. The ground shakes as another volley rattles across the field. But what you're really walking into is an older world one, before the long lines of musketeers became the norm. You picture yourself centuries earlier, when battles didn't look like this at all. Instead of shoulder-to-shoulder muskets, you would have stood inside a deep square of men with pikes jutting out like a porcupine, or hidden in the shadow of towering ranks stacked dozens deep. In that older age, war was a clash of bodies and blades. Infantry wasn't yet dominated by gunpowder, but by sharp steel and long spears. Imagine standing in a square formation of pikes, the shafts creaking in unison as men lower them like a bristling wall against a charging horseman. Each layer behind you presses forward your back, jammed into the chest of the man behind so tight you can barely breathe. Safety is in depth, dozens of ranks deep, so if the front line falters, there's always another to replace it. The fear of cavalry charges was constant, and dense formations were the only answer. But then comes the change. The first crack of arquebuses and matchlocks cuts across the battlefield like strange thunder. They're clumsy, smoky, and so slow to reload, you could eat a loaf of bread in the time it takes to prime one. Yet they bring something terrifying: firepower that pierces armor. Historians still argue whether knights truly became obsolete because of gunpowder, or whether logistics and economics mattered more, but the psychological effect was undeniable. For the first time, a common foot soldier with a crude firearm could kill an armored noble with one shot. The world tilted. You trudge further into this transition, noticing how armies scrambled to combine old with new. In one hand, the long pike remains a hedge against cavalry. In the other, men begin carrying firearms, though they fire in scattered bursts, unreliable and chaotic. This marriage of pike and shot creates the blocky formations of the 16th century thick columns that blend the stabbing hedge of spears with the noisy bite of early guns. From a distance, they look like moving fortresses. Up close, they're sweaty, panicked knots of men praying the match doesn't fizzle out. The Dutch, clever and methodical under Maurice of Nassau, start tinkering with these blocks. They stretch them out a little, make them thinner, drill men to fire in rotating volleys. You picture yourself in one of those counter-marching drills, stepping forward, firing, stepping back, reloading, while the next rank steps up. Like gears in a clock, each rank ticks forward and back, keeping the line of fire steady. It's mesmerizing, though you can imagine soldiers grumbling that it feels like square dancing with muskets. Still, the effect is clear. Fire becomes less random, more disciplined. And then, as you edge closer to the 17th century, you feel the battlefield beginning to stretch outward. Depth starts to matter less than breadth. The goal shifts from having 10 men stacked one behind the other to having as many muskets pointed at the enemy as possible. Why bury 9 men in the back who can't shoot when you could spread them out into a line and let them all fire? It's like suddenly realizing that 10 flashlights pointed forward are brighter than one flashlight with 9 bulbs taped behind it. You can sense why this change was radical. Deep columns were comforting. You could hide in the middle, shielded by those around you. In a line, there's no such luxury. Everyone is exposed. Everyone has a role. Everyone is responsible for sending lead downrange. It feels riskier, almost reckless, but it's effective. The wider the line, the more muskets blaze at once, and the greater the wall of fire that slams into the enemy. Yet you also feel the fragility of this system. Spread too thin and the line can shatter if pressed too hard. Cavalry might sweep around the edge and fold it like paper. Still, commanders gamble that the sheer force of collective fire will outweigh the danger. Firepower, not armor, becomes the deciding factor. And there's a quirky little detail. In some early battles, men armed with firearms had to carry lit match cords, with them smoldering ropes that could ignite the powder. Imagine thousands of soldiers walking with burning ropes, the air thick with acrid smoke, trying not to accidentally ignite their own cartridges or uniforms. Soldiers joked about smelling like a walking candle factory. You can only imagine how many accidental burns and mishaps that caused. By the late 1500s and early 1600s, the stage is set. The pike is still there, stubborn and tall, but it's slowly becoming the sidekick to the musket. You can feel the tension of a world in flux, deep, comforting blocks of spearmen on one hand, thin firing lines on the other. The battlefield is an experiment in geometry. How deep, how wide, how disciplined. Historians still argue whether the shift was inevitable because of technology or whether it was just clever generals seizing opportunities. The truth is probably both. You look over your shoulder and imagine the square of pikes behind you, their shafts glinting. You look ahead and see the faint outline of musketeers stretching thin across the field, ready to fire in volleys. You realize you're standing at a hinge point in history, the moment when armies begin to favor firepower over bulk, breadth over depth. And though you don't know it yet, this choice will shape battlefields for centuries to come. You wipe powder residue from your lips, the taste like burnt charcoal, and the scene before you shifts again. Now you're standing beside a figure whose name echoes across military history, Gustavus Adolphus of Sweden. The year is the early 1600s, and Europe is tearing itself apart in the 30 Years' War. The land is littered with scorched villages, endless columns of smoke rising from fields where armies march like locusts. You and your stiff boots and scratchy wool are about to see how this king of Sweden takes what the Dutch started and pushes it further, reshaping warfare itself. Gustavus doesn't look like a man you'd expect to change the face of battle. Stocky, broad-shouldered with a sandy beard, he's got the demeanor of a farmer who somehow picked up a crown. But don't be fooled, he's a tinkerer, a reformer. And he doesn't just want to win battles, he wants to redesign how they're fought. Standing there, you watch him sketch ideas in the dirt with a stick, as if the future of war can be drawn like a child's game of hopscotch. Before him, armies had lumbered across Europe in giant blocks, pike and shot in tight squares. They were unwieldy, slow, and easy to outmaneuver. Gustavus looks at them and shakes his head. Why stack men so deep when only the first few rows can fire? Why not stretch them thinner 2 or 3 ranks so every musket speaks at once? You shuffle nervously into one of these new lines, noticing the difference immediately. You're not buried in the middle of a giant block, invisible and safe. You're on the edge, weapon ready, exposed, but empowered. When the order comes, your shot joins hundreds of others, a blazing curtain of fire rather than a sputtering handful. It's not just the line itself Gustavus reimagines. He lightens the artillery breaking from the massive siege guns that crawl across muddy fields like stubborn oxen. His cannons are smaller, nimbler, pulled by horses and able to keep up with the infantry. You picture yourself hauling one of these lighter pieces, wheels rattling over cobblestones, setting it down in position where it can actually support the men rather than lag behind. Suddenly, firepower is mobile, not static. And then there's the cavalry. Instead of holding them back as a reserve hammer, Gustavus integrates them into the dance. You hear hooves thunder alongside your line as squadrons of Swedish horsemen charge in coordination with the infantry volleys. It feels like a symphony, every section of the army contributing its notes at the right time. Historians still argue whether Gustavus truly invented this orchestration or whether he just perfected what others had hinted at. Either way, when you're standing here musket in hand, it feels revolutionary. A quirky tidbit slips through the smoke. Gustavus apparently insisted his men keep their hair cropped short and their beards trimmed. Not out of fashion sense, but because in close quarter fighting, long hair and wild beards were perfect handholds for enemies to grab. Practical, yes, but also a bit comical. You picture a musketeer getting yanked by his goatee in the middle of a melee. Imagine the insult of dying not by bullet or blade, but by a pulled beard. The battles themselves, like Breitenfeld in 1631, show you why this shift matters. You're in the line, musket raised, and you see the enemy's massive tercios, those old Spanish squares of pike and shot lumbering forward. They look like giant slow-moving fortresses, blocks of men 30 ranks deep. They've crushed Europe for decades. But Gustavus's army is leaner, quicker stretched thin yet deadly. When the firing starts, you unleash volleys that ripple like waves, tearing holes into the deep masses that can't return fire effectively. Cannon shots punch through the packed ranks while cavalry wheels around their flanks. Suddenly, the once invincible tercios look clumsy, outdated, like dinosaurs stumbling into tar pits. You feel the thrill of innovation. Here you are, part of an army that's rewriting the rules. It's still brutal, still terrifying. The smoke, the screams, the clash of steel haven't gone anywhere, but you sense something different. Coordination, purpose, efficiency. It's not just about courage anymore, it's about design. Gustavus is turning war into something almost mechanical, a system where every cog matters. And yet, fragility lurks beneath. The line is powerful when it holds, but it demands discipline like nothing else. One break, one panicked flight, and the whole structure crumbles. You glance down the line at your comrades, each one vital. There's no hiding now, no safety in depth. Everyone's exposed, everyone's a target, and that means everyone must stand firm. Historians still debate whether Gustavus's reforms were truly revolutionary or simply evolutionary, an acceleration of trends already underway. Some argue he's more myth than mastermind, his reputation burnished after death to make Sweden look like the little kingdom that could. But standing here shoulder to shoulder in his line, you don't care. You feel the difference in your bones. The field is no longer dominated by static blocks, but by flowing lines of men whose volleys can change the tide in minutes. The tragedy, of course, is that Gustavus himself doesn't live to see the long-term results. At Lutzen in 1633, he dies in battle, cut down in the chaos he tried so hard to master. You picture the moment a king who fought in the front like a common soldier, swallowed by the smoke and fury. Even in death, though, his ideas ripple outward. Armies across Europe take notice. Generals copy the line, the mobility, the integration of firepower. The dominoes fall and the age of deep blocks slips into history. As you trudge away from the battlefield, ears ringing from musket volleys and cannons, you realize you've just lived through the turning of a page. War will never again be about sheer depth and bulk alone. From here on, the line, the thin, fragile, yet devastating line, will dominate. And you're stuck in it shoulder to shoulder, hoping the line holds. You raise your musket again, but this time the focus isn't on the shape of the formation, it's on the sound. A volley in the 17th or 18th century wasn't just noise. It was a carefully orchestrated crash of thunder, the deadly chorus of hundreds of muskets speaking at once. Imagine it. An officer raises his sword, a drumbeat, pauses, and then fire. The front rank unleashes a storm of smoke and flames so loud, It makes your ears ring and your chest thrum like a drumhead. You watch the balls streak invisibly into the haze, most destined to miss their targets entirely. Muskets of this era are notorious for their inaccuracy. The smooth-bore barrels send lead wandering unpredictably, so much so that aiming at a single man is almost laughable. You could point directly at him and the ball might veer 3 feet to the left. Historians still argue whether musketeers truly aimed or simply pointed in the general direction of the enemy line. But here's the truth you feel in your bones. The musket's real strength comes from multiplication. Alone, your shot is a coin toss at best. Together, the line's shot is a tidal wave. 10 men firing at once, perhaps only 2 find their mark. But 100 men firing at once, maybe 20 fall. 1,000. Suddenly, the air itself becomes lethal. This is why the volley mattered. It transformed inaccurate weapons into something terrifying. The choreography is as mesmerizing as it is deadly. Front rank fires, then steps back to reload, while the next rank steps forward. You can almost hear the rhythm like a chant bite, pour, ram, aim, fire. The motions become mechanical, drilled into you until you can do them blindfolded. There's even a kind of comfort in the repetition, though the comfort is laced with dread. The smoke is its own character on the field. With every volley, thick, white clouds billow out, curling and hanging low until visibility drops to almost nothing. You cough, eyes stinging, lungs coated with powder. Somewhere in that fog, the enemy is doing the exact same thing, their volleys answering yours. At times, you fire at nothing but smoke, trusting that there's still a line of men hidden inside. Soldiers joked that battlefields smelled like rotten eggs mixed with burnt hair, a stench that clung to their clothes for days. And then there's the quirky detail you can't ignore. Soldiers often used paper cartridges that held both powder and ball, tearing them open with their teeth. After a few battles, veterans' mouths would be permanently stained black from gunpowder residue. Some even lost teeth from constantly biting the coarse paper. It became a mark of experience. You could tell a soldier by his powder-blackened lips. Volley fire wasn't just about killing, it was about morale. You're standing there, shoulder to shoulder when your line erupts in flame and thunder. The sheer spectacle shakes your enemies. Even if only a fraction of the balls hit, the psychological weight is enormous. You see the enemy line waver, men flinching as the crash rolls over them. Some historians argue this intimidation factor was as important as the bullets themselves. The officers know this, which is why discipline is everything. You're forbidden to fire it at will. No matter how close the enemy seems, no matter how your hands tremble, you wait for the order. Because a ragged line firing piecemeal is weak. Its bullets scatter, its rhythm falters. But a unified volley, that's thunder rolling across the field, a sound that can break men's hearts before it breaks their bodies. You glance left and see a drummer boy no older than 12, pounding out the beat to keep your line steady. Imagine being that child too small to carry a musket, yet vital to the deadly rhythm. His hands blistered, his ears ringing. He plays the music of death and order all at once. Some boys stuffed cotton in their ears, but most just went half-deaf. It's one of those grimly odd details. The youngest on the field were sometimes the most essential. Volley after volley. You begin to feel detached, like the noise is happening to someone else. The battlefield becomes a strange dream of smoke sound and mechanical motion. And yet, each time the command echoes, you snap back. Present fire, reload. The chorus continues. You think of battles like Blenheim or Culloden, where volley fire turned the tide. At Blenheim in 1704, the disciplined volleys of Marlborough's troops shredded French forces who had never experienced such relentless precision. At Culloden in 1746, Jacobite Highlanders charged bravely with broadswords only to be cut down in swathes by disciplined British volleys. Courage couldn't outrun bullets. Historians still debate the exact casualty rates from volleys. Some suggest that only a few % of shots ever struck home. Others argue that in the right conditions, close range, good timing, a volley could be devastating. Either way, when you're in the line, you don't think in percentages. You just hear the crash, see men drop, and hope you're not one of them. The irony, of course, is that the musket was both a crude and a sophisticated weapon. Crude because it was inaccurate, smoky, and clumsy. Sophisticated because its power came from coordination from men drilled into human machinery. The volley wasn't just firepower, it was choreography, psychology, and discipline rolled into one. As the smoke thickens and your ears ring, you understand why the line existed. Alone, you're just a frightened man with a clumsy gun. Together, you're part of a deadly choir, each musket a note, each volley a chorus that shakes the world. And as you ram another ball down your barrel with aching arms, you know the chorus isn't ending anytime soon. You squint through the haze, ears still ringing from the last crash, and notice something strange. Despite the chaos, everything around you feels organized. The drums beat in steady patterns, flags wave like signals in a storm, and officers' voices cut through the smoke with sharp commands. You realize you're not just firing in a line, you're marching as one body. Thousands of men moving together like gears in a single machine. The discipline is uncanny. You step when told, you stop when told, and you fire when told. Your musket isn't just your weapon, it's one cog in a much larger mechanism. Alone, you'd probably sprint for the nearest ditch. But together you advance across open ground lines, rippling forward with a strange, dreadful grace. Historians still argue whether this rigid control was a strength or a weakness. Some say it gave commanders the ability to maneuver armies on a massive scale. Others say it stripped away the soldiers' instincts, turning them into walking targets. You feel the weight of that paradox with each step. When the order comes to wheel left, you and hundreds of others pivot in unison, boots crunching on gravel, muskets angled just so. From a hill, it must look like choreography, the battlefield transformed into a deadly dance floor. But from where you stand, it feels like your life depends on not breaking step. One man stumbling could throw off the whole movement. And then there's the chaos factor smoke. Black powder produces so much of it that within minutes of battle visibility drops to almost nothing. You might not even see the enemy you just fire into the gray fog, trusting the officer's orders. That's where flags, drums, and bugles come in. They're not just decoration or ceremony, they're lifelines. Without them, the army would dissolve into confusion. You picture yourself straining to hear a drum beat, watching desperately for the bright slash of your regiment's flag through the haze. Those sounds and colors are your compass, your only guide in a world reduced to noise and smoke. Quirky detail: some armies even had special color guards who weren't just protecting the flag as a symbol of honor, but literally keeping it visible so men wouldn't get lost in the fog. Losing the flag didn't just mean shame, it meant losing the ability to tell where you belonged. Imagine wandering blind on a battlefield, no idea if the shadow next to you is friend or foe. That's why men would die, rather than let their flag fall. As you march, you also notice how strange it feels to trust men you can't see. The general might be half a mile behind you, mounted on a horse, watching the battlefield, like a chessboard. His orders flow down through colonels, captains, sergeants, until finally they reach you, just another soldier in the line. You never see the grand plan. You only feel it in the way your formation wheels and halts. It's like being a pawn pushed square by square, never knowing the whole game. And yet, there's a strange comfort in this. When you're terrified, you don't want to make decisions. You want someone else to decide. The line relieves you of choice. It says, stand here, aim there, fire now. Your role is simple. Your survival depends on trust that the men beside you won't break, that the officers above you know what they're doing, that the army as a whole is stronger than the fear gnawing in your gut. Historians still debate how much control generals really had in this era. Did they truly maneuver their armies like chess pieces? Or did they simply point them in a direction and hope discipline carried the day? Either way, from your place in the line, it feels real. You march, you pivot, you fire all without seeing the bigger picture. The system works, at least until the enemy does something unexpected. The irony is that this discipline comes at a price. You're locked in formation even when common sense screams otherwise. You can't dive behind a tree. You can't scatter when cannonballs plow into the line. You stand shoulder to shoulder because that's what the system demands. Soldiers joked grimly that their officers were more dangerous than the enemy, better to face musket balls than a colonel's wrath for breaking formation. A fringe tidbit that always gets overlooked: men often drilled with wooden muskets, endlessly practicing the motions of firing without actually loading powder. Some regiments spent more time rehearsing the dance than firing live rounds. It made sense you couldn't waste precious powder in endless practice shots. But it also meant that soldiers sometimes went into battle having fired their weapon only a handful of times. You can imagine the nerves. Your life depends on a tool you've barely used, yet you're expected to wield it with machine-like precision. And yet somehow it holds. You see armies cross rivers, climb hills, and advance across wide fields all in perfect lines. When they succeed, it's breathtaking. When they fail, it's catastrophic. One misstep, one panic, and the entire machine unravels into chaos. That's the gamble generals take. Think of Frederick the Great of Prussia, who in the 18th century drilled his soldiers to near robotic perfection. They could march, fire, and wheel with a speed and precision that stunned Europe. To his enemies, it looked like sorcery. To his men, it felt like tyranny. But on the battlefield, when his lines fired faster and straighter than anyone else's, you could see why discipline mattered. And yet, as you trudge forward in your own line, you can't shake the absurdity. You're exposed, visible, vulnerable. One cannonball could mow down half a dozen men in an instant. One lucky shot could silence the drummer you rely on for direction. The discipline is impressive, but it's also fragile, balanced on the edge of fear and obedience. Still, as the drums beat and the flags wave, you keep marching. You're part of something bigger, something that feels both mechanical and human at once. You may not know the grand plan, but in this moment, you know your role. And as long as the line holds, you march as one body through smoke, through fire, through fear. The air quivers before you and your stomach drops as a low rumble builds on the horizon. It isn't thunder, it's hooves. A cavalry charge is forming, the sound growing like a drumbeat rising from the earth itself. You glance at your comrades' faces, pale jaws, clenched hands slick on their muskets, and you understand why the line exists. Against cavalry, survival doesn't come from courage alone. It comes from unity. You see them crest the rise, horsemen's sabers, gleaming plumes dancing in the wind. They look unstoppable, a tidal wave of muscle and steel. Your instinct screams run, but there's nowhere to go. If you scatter, you die. A lone man can't outrun a horse, can't block a saber. You stand because you must. The line is your only hope. The officer's voice cuts sharp. Hold. The command vibrates through your bones. Bayonets glint as men fix steel to muzzles, turning your fragile muskets into a wall of spikes. You realize this isn't just about firepower anymore. It's about presenting a united front, a hedge of bristling teeth that no sane horse wants to slam into. Cavalrymen know this. Their power lies in shock, in fear. If you hold, you live. If you break, they carve through you like cloth. Historians still argue whether horses would truly refuse to impale themselves on bayonets, or whether cavalrymen always veered away before the moment of impact. The debate is almost comical, but when you're here standing in the line, you don't want to test the theory. You grip your musket tighter, praying the wall holds. The command comes, present muskets rise, fire. A ripple of flame and smoke bursts forth. The front rank kneels, smoke curling around their faces, while the next rank fires overhead. The volley slams into the charging mass horses, rearing riders tumbling. The sound is deafening, the sight horrifying, and yet they keep coming. The survivors thunder forward, sabers raised high, the ground trembling with each hoofbeat. Quirky detail: some soldiers swore they could smell cavalry before they saw them, the mix of leather, sweat, and horse dung carried on the wind. One French soldier even wrote that the stench of an approaching charge was enough to make him gag before the hooves appeared. Not exactly the glamorous image of knights in shining armor. You can feel why commanders clung to line formations. Against cavalry, they were one of the few tactics that worked. A scattered mob would be annihilated. A square of disciplined men, bayonets out, could withstand even elite horsemen. You imagine being in one of those hollow squares, 4 lines forming a box, officers and drummers huddled in the middle, wounded men dragged to safety inside. Outside, a living wall of steel points outward in every direction. It's claustrophobic, sweaty, terrifying, but it works. Think of Waterloo, 1815. You picture British infantry forming squares as Napoleon's cavalry swarmed them again and again. The French charged with stunning bravery, riding straight into walls of steel and smoke. Time after time, the squares held. Men inside the formation could hear the thunder of hooves, see the flash of sabers, feel horses veer at the last second. Some squares lost dozens, even hundreds, but the formation never broke. That was the power of discipline. And yet you also see the fragility. The line is strong from the front, but its flanks and rear are vulnerable. If cavalry circles behind, if another formation punches into your side, you're in trouble. That's why the line always operates in groups overlapping, protecting each other's edges. One unit's left flank is another unit's right flank. The army becomes a vast patchwork quilt of lines, each covering the other. Break one piece, and the quilt unravels. The psychological pressure is immense. You stand there, musket shaking, as hundreds of horses thunder down. Your gut tells you no human wall could withstand such power. But then, you see the first rank hold. You hear the volley crack. You see riders topple. Suddenly, the impossible feels survivable. Fear ebbs, replaced by grim determination. You become less a man and more a piece of the wall. Historians still debate whether cavalry in the 18th and 19th centuries was overrated or whether it remained decisive. Some argue that cavalry charges rarely broke disciplined infantry. Others point to moments like at Minden in 1759, where cavalry ripped holes in the enemy. The truth, as usual, lies somewhere in the smoke. But standing here in the line, you don't think about scholarly debates. You think about the sheer terror of watching death on horseback thunder towards you. You think about your hands blistering on the musket stock, your bayonet gleaming like a fragile toothpick. You think about whether the man next to you will hold or break. Because if he runs, the wall collapses, and you're done. The horses are closer now, eyes wide, nostrils flaring. You see the whites of their eyes, the froth on their mouths. Another volley erupts, louder, hotter, closer. Horses scream, riders topple, but still the mass presses forward. And then at the very last moment, the line holds. The wall stands. The charge splinters. You breathe, chest heaving, ears ringing. You survived for now. The cavalry will regroup. They'll charge again. This deadly dance repeats volley after volley, charge after charge, until one side finally breaks. And as you wipe sweat and powder from your brow, you understand why soldiers fought in lines, because against cavalry, it was the only way to live. The ground still trembles from the retreating cavalry, but you barely have time to breathe before a new realization dawns. Your line is only safe so long as it faces forward. To your front, you're strong. To your sides, to your back, you're meat. You glance left and right down the line, the uniforms stretching away into smoke, and your stomach knots. The flanks are the great weakness of every formation. And you know, every commander on the field is thinking the same thing. How do I get around the enemy's side before they get around mine? You picture it like a board game. Two long strips of soldiers facing each other, each trying to stretch farther than the other to outflank, to bend the line like a piece of string until it snaps. You hear the officers muttering about refusing the flank, angling part of the formation backward like a hinge to cover the exposed side. It sounds clever in theory, but standing there shoulder to shoulder, you realize it feels more like being a door creaking awkwardly under pressure. Historians still argue whether most line battles were truly decided by direct musket volleys or by the moment one side's flank got turned. Many suggest it was almost always the latter. Once the flank was exposed, panic spread faster than bullets. A line under fire could stand for hours. A line attacked from the side might collapse in minutes. And you can see why. Imagine firing straight ahead, reloading in rhythm, when suddenly screams erupt from your left. You glance over and see cavalry pouring in from the side, or enemy infantry wheeling into position. Your musket loaded and ready is pointing the wrong way. You feel naked. Your bayonet is useless unless you twist and pivot, and in that moment of chaos, order disintegrates. A quirky tidbit: some armies station their most reliable veteran units on the flanks specifically because those edges were the most vulnerable. In the Prussian army, for instance, officers would often place grenadiers, tall, intimidating men who, originally carried grenades at the line's ends to stiffen resolve. They were supposed to be the hinges holding the whole door steady. In theory, grenadiers were elite. In practice, they were just men as likely to panic as anyone else when sabers flashed at their side. You think of Cannae centuries earlier, when Hannibal's Carthaginians enveloped the Romans from both flanks, swallowing them whole. That was long before muskets, but the lesson carried forward: once you're surrounded, you're finished. Generals studied those ancient battles with almost religious devotion. They all feared another Cannae. And in the age of lines, Cannae could happen again at any moment. The tension gnaws at you as you stand in formation. To the front, you're calm. To the sides, you're jittery. Every rustle of movement makes you flinch. The drummer beats on the flag's wave, but you can't stop thinking about what's happening beyond your vision. You know the enemy is trying to stretch farther to outflank you, just as your own officers are urging you to edge forward to extend to outflank them. It's like watching two snakes circling, each trying to bite the other's tail. Historians still debate how much of this was intentional maneuvering and how much was accidental drift. In the smoke and noise, lines often lost alignment. Units slid apart. Gaps opened, flanks exposed themselves without anyone meaning to. The battlefield wasn't always a neat chessboard. It was often a messy quilt of half-seen movements, with flanks unraveling by mistake as much as by design. And yet the fear of being flanked never left soldiers' minds. You can almost hear it in their campfire talk: better to be shot in the chest than stabbed in the back. Being outflanked meant shame, disaster, annihilation. Some soldiers swore that hearing the enemy's volleys from the side was worse than seeing them from the front. It was the sound of doom creeping up like a shadow. Quirky fat commanders sometimes posted their drummers or fifers on the flanks so that in the noise, the beat would remind men to hold steady. A lone boy with a drum might be all that kept panic from spreading. Imagine being that child, beating desperately as men around you broke and fled. There's a reason drummers were sometimes killed first by the enemy to silence the rhythm that held the line together. You think of Saratoga in the American Revolutionary War. The British tried to extend their lines in the dense forests, only to find themselves flanked by American militia using the trees as cover. The Redcoats' rigid line dissolved as fire poured in from the sides. It wasn't the volley to their front that broke them, it was the realization that their sides and backs were bleeding. And yet the line endured for centuries, despite this weakness. Because the alternatives were worse. Spread too thin, you'd be annihilated. Too deep, and most of your muskets never fired. The line was the compromised, strong, forward, fragile sides. Generals gambled that discipline, overlapping formations, and sheer courage would hold the flanks long enough to win. But standing here, musket trembling, you don't feel like a piece of a grand strategy. You feel like bait on a hook. You know your strength lies in your front, and you pray the enemy doesn't figure out how to bite your side. Every shout, every flash in the smoke makes you twitch toward your left or right, half expecting doom to come galloping in. You remind yourself of the sergeant's words last night. Keep your eyes forward, lad. The man to your side will cover you, and you'll cover him. Trust the line. You want to believe him. You want to trust that the men beside you won't break, but deep down, you know, if the flank crumbles, the line crumbles. And when the line crumbles, you're alone again. The fear of flanks is the silent heartbeat of line warfare. It shapes every movement, every order, every plan. And as you stand, shoulder-aching, ears ringing, you understand why soldiers fought in lines and why they dreaded them too. You're safe in the front, but the sides are ghosts waiting to swallow you whole. You stand rigid in the line, the smoke thinning just enough for sunlight to glint on something new. Steel fixed to the ends of muskets. A ripple of unease runs through you as officers bark, fix bayonets. The motion is quick, almost casual, but you feel the weight of history in it. Where once men carried separate pikes alongside muskets, now the two weapons have fused into one. You've become both shooter and spearman in a single breath. The bayonet changes everything. Before its invention, infantry relied heavily on pikemen to keep cavalry at bay and to defend against close assaults. Musketeers on their own were vulnerable. Once the enemy closed the gap, your gun was little more than a club. That's why armies carried both pikes and muskets, weaving them together into mixed formations. But with the bayonet, especially the socket bayonet that slips neatly over the muzzle, you no longer need two kinds of troops. The pike fades into memory, and every musketeer becomes a hybrid. You sense the irony. You've just spent minutes loading powder-ramming shot and fumbling with cartridges only for an officer to command charged bayonets. Suddenly, you're not a shooter, but a stabber. Historians still argue whether bayonet charges caused many actual casualties or whether they worked mainly as psychological weapons. Some sources claim the majority of men fell before the enemy even reached stabbing range, broken by the sight of a wall of steel advancing relentlessly. But when you're here in the line with a bayonet gleaming in your hands, you don't care about scholarly debates. You care about the man 20 paces away, eyes wide, also pointing a steel-tipped musket at you. Quirky detail early plug bayonets before the socket design were clumsy things you had to shove directly into the muzzle. That meant once the bayonet was fixed, you couldn't fire your musket at all. Imagine fumbling with powder ramming shot and then realizing you've literally corked your gun shut with a knife. Soldiers joked they were carrying very expensive spears. Thankfully, the socket design solved this, but it shows how awkward innovation can be before it matures. The bayonet drills are as brutal as they are monotonous. You lunge, thrust, parry, recover over and over until your arms ache. Officers scream about aiming low, better to stab a man in the gut than swing too high and miss. The gruesome practicality unsettles you. Still, when the order comes, you move in unison, hundreds of bayonets thrusting forward like the spines of a giant hedgehog. You remember tales from battles like Malplaquet or Culloden, where bayonet charges decided the day. At Culloden, Highlanders armed with broadswords rushed headlong into British lines, only to meet bristling bayonets. It wasn't just the steel that stopped them, it was the resolve of men standing shoulder to shoulder, unwilling to break. Historians still debate whether most Highlanders fell to bullets or blades, but the image of bayonet walls remains iconic. And yet, you sense the psychological power more than the physical. The thought of being stabbed up close, of feeling steel slide between ribs, terrifies you in a way that distant musket fire never does. A musket ball might strike you before you even notice. A bayonet, though, comes with a face attached. You see the whites of the attacker's eyes, hear his grunt, smell his sweat. It's personal, visceral, nightmarish. Perhaps that's why bayonets broke more men than they killed. The charge itself often shattered morale before the blades touched flesh. A fringe tidbit drifts through your mind. During the American Revolutionary War, British troops were notorious for their bayonet charges. At Bunker Hill, American militiamen low on ammunition finally broke when the British advanced with fixed bayonets. Few were actually stabbed, most simply fled rather than face cold steel. The weapon's power was as much in the imagination as in reality. You also think of Napoleonic warfare, where entire battles seemed to climax in bayonet charges. French columns would advance under fire muskets blazing until they were within striking distance, and then suddenly they'd surge forward with bayonets. Sometimes the enemy held, sometimes they broke, but always the clash carried drama. Napoleon himself reportedly said that battles were won not by bullets, but by the last reserve. And that last reserve often carried bayonets. The absurdity doesn't escape you. Here you are, armed with a firearm, reverting back to medieval stabbing. It feels like two worlds colliding: the age of pikes lingering in the steel tip, the age of gunpowder roaring in the barrel. You're both knight and marksman, both spearman and musketeer. The officer orders another drill. You lunge forward, bayonet out, and the line shuffles with you. The sound of boots pounding in rhythm is almost musical, terrifying in its unity. You realize that what terrifies the enemy isn't just the steel, it's the sight of hundreds of men charging as one, a wall of humanity turned into a machine of death. And then you wonder, what if you trip? What if you hesitate? The man behind you will push you forward. Bayonet lowered, whether you like it or not. The line demands unity even in the face of chaos. You're not just fighting, you're being carried by momentum. Once the bayonet's lower, there's no turning back. Historians still debate whether the bayonet was truly decisive or whether artillery and musket fire did most of the killing. But for soldiers, the bayonet symbolized resolve. Fixing bayonets wasn't just preparation, it was a statement. We are ready to close. It stiffened spines, silenced doubts, and reminded everyone that retreat was no longer an option. You glance at the gleaming steel along your line points, catching the light like stars in a smoky night. Your heart pounds, your breath comes fast, but you hold steady. The bayonet has replaced the pike, and now you too are both shield and spear. And in this fragile line of men, that steel might be the only thing standing between life and death. Your bayonet is still fixed, gleaming in the haze, but the officer waves you back into formation. At ease, he mutters, though nothing about this moment feels easy. You wipe the sweat from your brow and look down at your musket. It's lighter than the clunky matchlocks of earlier generations. The wood feels smoother, the barrel shorter, the mechanism quicker. You realize you're holding not just a weapon, but a piece of progress. By the 18th century, muskets had become simpler, cheaper, and easier to use. Flintlock ignition replaced the awkward, smoky match cords of the past. Now, instead of carrying burning ropes into battle, accidentally setting your own powder on fire, you just snap back the cock, prime the pan with a pinch of powder, and squeeze the trigger. A spark leaps from flint to steel, igniting the charge. Quicker, cleaner, more reliable. You breathe a little easier knowing that when you pull the trigger, it's more likely to fire. And then there's the weight. You remember hearing old veterans complain about the monstrous arquebuses they once lugged into war so heavy you could barely fire without resting it on a support. Your musket, though not exactly light, is manageable. You can march for miles with it slung over your shoulder. You can fire, reload, and fire again without collapsing from exhaustion. The weapon has evolved alongside the tactics, each shaping the other. Quirky tidbit soldiers often name their muskets, treating them like companions. Some carved initials into the stocks, others painted little designs. One British grenadier reportedly nicknamed his musket Sweet Bess, claiming it was more faithful than any woman he'd ever met. You can imagine the laughter around the campfire men cuddling muskets like sweethearts, joking to mask the dread of using them the next morning. The improvements matter most in rhythm. A well-drilled soldier could now fire 3, maybe even 4 shots per minute. That doesn't sound like much in the age of machine guns, but when multiplied by hundreds of men in a line, it becomes a storm. Volley fire, faster and steadier than ever, turns the battlefield into a thunderclap every 20 seconds. You think of the American Revolution, where these lighter flintlock muskets made it possible for citizen militias to stand toe-to-toe with the world's most powerful army. At battles like Saratoga or Yorktown, lines of farmers turned soldiers fired in disciplined volleys, muskets clacking in near unison. The weapons weren't perfectly accurate, but they didn't need to be. What mattered was the rhythm, the massed firepower. Historians still argue about the musket's true effectiveness. Was it a precision instrument, or was it little better than pointing a noisy stick in the enemy's general direction? Some claim muskets could reliably hit a man at 80 yards. Others insist it was closer to 30. The truth is slippery, hidden in the fog of battle. But you don't care about numbers. You care that your musket fires when you need it to, and that you can load it again before the enemy closes the gap. Of course, the musket isn't perfect. Powder fouling gums up the barrel, smoke still blinds you after each volley, and rain can ruin everything. You remember the panic of dropping cartridges into mud, scrambling to wipe them clean before reloading. You remember biting into paper that was damp powder clumping uselessly between your teeth. The musket was progress, but it was still fragile. And yet in your hands, it feels like a lifeline. You know that with every improvement, lighter barrels, sturdier locks, faster, firing, the line itself grows stronger. Each man's shot multiplied by hundreds makes the formation more deadly, more reliable, more terrifying to face. It's a cycle. Technology shapes tactics, tactics demand new technology. The musket isn't just a tool, it's the backbone of the line. Quirky detail you can't forget. Soldiers were trained to reload without looking so they could keep their eyes forward on the enemy. This to endless drills, ramming cartridges home in perfect rhythm. Some men grew so quick they could reload blindfolded. A French officer once joked that he could wake his grenadiers in the middle of the night, shout, "Make ready," and watch them load muskets in their sleep. And then there's the bayonet, still fixed at the end, a reminder that even the best musket might not save you once the enemy charges close. You feel the contradiction in your hands, a weapon meant for ranged fire that must also serve as a spear. The musket has evolved, but it hasn't escaped the brutality of close combat. You picture battles where this mattered, like the 7 Years' War, where lines of musketeers clashed in Europe, India, and the Americas. The musket was global now, carried across oceans, shaping empires. At Plassey in 1757, a handful of British troops with muskets overwhelmed a vastly larger Indian army armed with outdated artillery and cavalry. Technology wasn't just changing tactics, it was changing the balance of the world. Historians still debate whether it was the musket itself or the discipline behind it that truly won these wars. A musket in untrained hands was almost useless, but in the hands of a drilled line, it became a force of nature. You feel this as you glance down the row of soldiers beside you, each one loading, aiming, firing in rhythm. Alone, you'd be weak. Together, you're devastating. The musket has grown lighter, quicker, sharper, but it's still imperfect. It fills the air with smoke, it jams, it misfires, it burns your lips black. And yet, in this age, it is enough. It makes the line possible, and the line makes war what it is. You wipe the barrel, blow away the powder dust, and ready yourself for another volley. Because in the end, you realize the musket isn't just a weapon. It's a promise that you and your comrades standing shoulder to shoulder can hold against anything. Cavalry columns, chaos, it doesn't matter. As long as the musket fires, the line holds. And as long as the line holds you live. You hear the order shouted across the field, sharper than the crack of muskets, form square. The line that has stretched wide and thin suddenly begins to fold inward, rank by rank, like a massive piece of paper being creased into shape. You shuffle sideways, pivot, then wheel inward, boots grinding in the dirt. Within moments, you find yourself standing on one side of a hollow box of men, four walls bristling with bayonets pointing outward. The infantry square. To outsiders, it looks almost ceremonial, like soldiers playing at geometry, but inside, it feels like survival distilled. Cavalry swarms the battlefield, hooves pounding like drums of doom, sabers flashing in the sunlight. In a line, you'd be exposed from the side, shredded in minutes. In a square, every direction is covered. You press shoulder to shoulder with your comrades, staring out over a hedge of steel. Your arms ache from holding the musket forward, bayonet jutting like a thorn, but you don't dare lower it. The square lives or dies by unity. Historians still argue whether squares were ever truly impregnable. Some claim no disciplined square was ever broken by cavalry. Others point to scattered examples, chaotic retreats, artillery bombardments, or sheer panic that shattered even the toughest formations. Standing here though, you feel the square's power. Horses charge, eyes rolling, but they swerve at the last second. No animal willingly impales itself on a wall of spikes. Cavalrymen circle fire pistols, hurl insults, but they don't break through. You breathe a little easier knowing your fragile body is shielded by geometry itself. And yet, the square has its terrors. You're trapped inside. Once formed, there's no maneuvering, no retreat. You're a box nailed to the ground. If artillery finds you, there's nowhere to run. Cannonballs plow into the ranks, tearing holes in the living wall. You hear the screams of men collapsing their spots, hastily filled by those behind. Every casualty makes the square weaker, thinner, more fragile. You stand stiff, heart pounding, praying the cavalry tires before the artillery finds its range. A quirky tidbit floats into your memory at the Battle of Waterloo. When British squares faced down repeated French cavalry charges, some soldiers reportedly joked to keep their spirits up. One account mentions a square that, while under attack, began singing songs to steady their nerves. Imagine that, hundreds of men sabers flashing around them, belting out tunes as if they were at a tavern instead of on the brink of death. Humor as armor. Inside the square, life shrinks. The officers and drummers huddle in the center along with the wounded. Powder smoke clings to the air, stinging your throat. You can hear horses, screaming riders shouting the constant ring of steel, but your vision narrows to the narrow arc in front of your bayonet. You can't afford to look away. If the man beside you falters, if you flinch, the whole side weakens. The square is only as strong as its weakest corner. Think of the British army at Quatre Bras 2 days before Waterloo. A square held firm against French cavalry, even as cannonballs ripped into it. Men died by the dozen, but the formation endured. Wellington himself rode past and muttered they must stand there, and they did, because to break meant annihilation. Historians still debate how terrifying these moments were compared to facing musket volleys. Some argue cavalry charges rarely caused mass casualties. Most soldiers fell to artillery or musket fire instead. But ask anyone who stood in a square, the psychological terror of waiting for hooves to crash into your wall of steel was worse than the wounds themselves. You didn't just fear death, you anticipated it in slow motion as the thunder grew louder, closer, heavier. You notice something else in the square time stretches. Each minute feels like an hour. You can't move, can't relax, can't even shift your weight without risking the cohesion of the formation. Your arms shake, your legs ache, sweat trickles down your back, but you stay locked in position. The square is discipline incarnate, and discipline is agony. Quirky fact, some squares carried livestock, sheep or cows, into battle for fresh food. When the formation closed, the animals ended up penned inside, bewildered and terrified. Imagine standing shoulder to shoulder with men and muskets while a bleeding sheep panics at your feet during a cavalry charge. War is brutal, but sometimes it's absurd too. And yet the square saved lives. At Waterloo, French cavalry charged British squares again and again, failing each time. Survivors later said it wasn't the musket fire that held them back, but the sheer visual of an unbroken wall of bayonets. The image alone was enough to sap courage. One officer recalled a French rider leaning down, shaking his saber at the square and then wheeling away. The message was clear: we can't crack you. Of course, not all squares held. At the Battle of Garcia Hernandez in 1812, British cavalry smashed through French squares, not by sheer impact, but because a horse fell dead at the front, toppling into the formation and creating a gap. Panic rippled the gap, widened, and the square collapsed. You realize it doesn't take much. One unlucky stumble, one break in discipline, and the geometry unravels. Inside your own square, you shift your weight. Sweat-dripping bayonet, still fixed outward. The cavalry circles, looking for weakness. You hear your officer bark encouragement voice, hoarse but steady. Hold, lads, hold. You grit your teeth, stare over your steel, and wait. Because the square, for all its terror, represents the core truth of line warfare. Survival comes not from one man's courage, but from all men's obedience. Alone, you'd be a corpse beneath a horse's hooves. Together, you're a box of iron daring the world to break you. The cavalry fades into the smoky distance, and for a moment the field falls eerily quiet. But not for long. Ahead, scattered figures move through hedgerows and trees, their coats less uniform, their spacing looser. You narrow your eyes. These aren't line infantry, they're skirmishers, light troops trained to fight in ways the rigid line cannot. They dart forward, kneel fire, then vanish like ghosts. You realize the battlefield is changing. Not everyone fights shoulder to shoulder anymore. Skirmishers are unnerving because they break all the rules you've been drilled to follow. No tight ranks, no fixed rhythm, no drum beats to guide their step. They use cover trees, rocks, ditches, and they don't fire in volleys, but in scattered shots, each man picking a target. It feels almost unfair, like trying to swat flies with a sword. You crouch in your line, smoke choking your lungs while musket balls whistle in from unseen shooters hidden in the brush. Historians still argue whether light infantry were decisive or merely a nuisance. Some generals dismiss them as pests, more distraction than threat. Others praise them as the eyes and ears of the army, harassing enemies, shielding main formations, and breaking the rigid symmetry of the battlefield. From where you're standing, though, they're terrifying. A line can face forward against an enemy line, but against scattered shadows, Flitting through woods, you feel exposed, helpless, like a target painted on your chest. A quirky tidbit in the 18th century British officers resisted the idea of widespread light infantry for years, claiming it's encouraged slovenly behavior. Skirmishers didn't stand straight, didn't march in rhythm, didn't look neat in parades. For armies obsessed with order and spectacle, the very concept of troops allowed to crouch, hide, and fight independently seemed like heresy. And yet battles kept proving their worth, forcing even the most rigid commanders to adapt. You think of the American Revolutionary War, where colonial militias made skirmishing their signature. At Lexington, Concord, and countless ambushes, farmers with muskets fired from behind trees and stone walls, disappearing before British regulars could return fire. The redcoats, trained for lines and volleys, found themselves bleeding from unseen enemies. Discipline meant little when the battlefield itself turned into a maze of cover. In Europe, too, skirmishers became more prominent. French chasseurs, Austrian Grenzer, Prussian Jaegers, all masters of loose order fighting. These men often came from rural backgrounds, skilled hunters, comfortable in forests and mountains. They carried rifles more accurate than muskets, though slower to reload, and they aimed with intent. You remember hearing a chilling fact: some commanders discouraged riflemen from aiming at officers, calling it ungentlemanly. Others encouraged it outright, knowing decapitation of leadership could unravel entire lines. Historians still debate the ethics of it. Was it war or murder? But in the smoke, no one cared about etiquette. The role of skirmishers wasn't just to kill, but to confuse. They screened your line, absorbing the first shock-masking enemy movements. They softened you before the hammer fell. You'd march into position, already rattled, ammunition wasted on targets you could barely see, nerves frayed from constant harassment. Then when the enemy's main line advanced, you'd be weaker, shakier, less ready. You feel the difference when the officer orders a few of your comrades to deploy forward as pickets. They scatter, crouching behind hedges, firing irregularly. It looks chaotic compared to the perfect geometry of the line. And yet their fire slows, the enemy blinds them, frustrates them. You realize there's a strange beauty in this looseness, a flexibility the line lacks. Quirky fact: some armies gave their light troops hunting horns instead of drums. The sound carried through forests, better signaling movements without revealing exact positions. Imagine creeping through dense woods, horn calls, echoing faintly each note, telling you when to fire, when to fall back, when to advance. It must have felt like a secret language music turned into strategy. You think of Napoleon's armies, where tirailleurs and voltigeurs became essential. Before the great columns advanced, his skirmishers would fan out, stinging the enemy like bees, forcing them to waste volleys on shadows. By the time the French main body reached musket range, the foe was already bleeding. Historians still debate how decisive these skirmish screens really were. Some say they were mere preludes, distractions before the main clash of lines. Others argue they were the cracks that widened, undermining the line's rigid dominance. What's clear is that by the late 18th century, no army could ignore them. Even the proudest drill masters grudgingly raised light infantry battalions. From your place in the square or line, you feel the difference. Facing cavalry is terror, facing volleys is thunder. But facing skirmishers is irritation that turns into dread. You never know when the next ball will snap past your ear. You never know if the officer shouting at you now will still be standing a minute later. You can't volley into smoke and expect results. It's like trying to fight mist with a hammer. And yet, you adapt. Your line fires ragged shots into the trees, your own skirmishers trade blows with theirs, and you pray the enemy reveals their main force soon. Because as much as you fear the rigid clash of volleys, at least in that chaos, you know the rules. Against the whispers in the trees, the battlefield feels alien, unsettling, almost unfair. You wipe sweat from your brow, the sound of distant horns fading into the smoke. The skirmishers retreat, their work done. You know what comes next. The enemy line will appear, drums pounding, colors flying, and you'll be back in formation, shoulder to shoulder, musket heavy in your hands. But you'll never forget the shadows in the woods, the men who fought by different rules, who made you feel like prey before the real battle even began. The smoke clears just enough for you to glimpse something new glinting across the field. At first, it looks like an ordinary musket barrel, but then you notice the spiral grooves cut into the inside of the bore, a rifled musket. You blink trying to understand what this means until the officer explains the bullet spins. Instead of wobbling drunkenly through the air like a smooth-bore musket ball, this one flies straight, steady, deadly accurate. You heft one of these new weapons, the kind that fires the mini-A ball, a conical bullet that expands when fired, gripping the grooves of the rifling. It's heavier in your hands, slower to load, but the difference is staggering. Where once you could barely hit a man at 50 yards, now you can aim at someone hundreds of yards away and actually strike them. The rifle transforms the battlefield from a close-range thunderclap into a long-distance killing ground. Historians still argue whether generals fully understood what they had unleashed in the mid-19th century. Some say commanders ignored the implications, stubbornly clinging to old-line tactics. Others insist they saw the danger but lacked alternatives in a world still built on marching columns and coordinated volleys. Either way, you, the soldier, feel the difference in your bones. You crouch, aim carefully, and watch a figure collapse hundreds of yards away. Before he would have been safe. Now nowhere feels safe. Quirky tidbit, the mini-ball, despite its name, wasn't tiny at all. It was a fat, heavy slug, often over half an inch wide, that shattered bone and tore flesh with horrifying force. Soldiers joked bitterly that being hit by one was less like being shot and more like being demolished. Surgeons dreaded them because wounds were ragged, messy, almost impossible to repair with the crude medicine of the time. And here's the chilling truth. The rise of rifled muskets doesn't just make your weapon stronger, it makes the old line weaker. Standing shoulder to shoulder in neat ranks is suicide when the enemy can pick you off at 300 yards. Once you could march within musket range before suffering heavy losses. Now you die long before you can close the gap. You feel the ground of warfare shifting beneath your boots. You think of the Crimean War, where British, French, and Russian troops first saw rifled muskets used en masse. At the Battle of Alma in 1854, rifle fire devastated advancing Russian columns long before they reached musket range. Officers realized too late that the game had changed. The lessons were bloody but not always absorbed. Old habits die hard. And then, of course, you think of the American Civil War. This is where the rifle's true impact is etched into history. Lines of blue and gray still march out, drums beating, banners flying, officers on horseback pointing swords like something out of the Napoleonic era. But the weapons they face are different. At Antietam, Fredericksburg, Gettysburg fields are raked by rifle fire at distances once unimaginable. Men fall in heaps before they can even glimpse the whites of the enemy's eyes. Historians still debate whether generals were blind or simply trapped by logistics. Armies were massive, millions strong, and coordinating them still required rigid formations. The line offered control, visibility, and discipline. But against rifled muskets, it became a meat grinder. You picture yourself trudging forward at Fredericksburg, Confederate riflemen entrenched on the high ground. Volley after volley tears through your ranks long before you can fire back. Courage is useless when technology outruns tactics. A quirky fact drifts into your mind. Soldiers sometimes wrap the bullets in bits of paper smeared with grease to make loading smoother. They'd bite open cartridges with their teeth, tasting grease powder and lead. Some even joked about which army's cartridges tasted worse, Union or Confederate. Gallows humor in the face of carnage. You crouch behind a stone wall musket heavy in your arms and notice another change. Cover matters now. In the old days, lines stood in the open because muskets were too inaccurate to make ducking worthwhile. With rifles, cover is life. Trees, fences, rocks, anything becomes precious. You realize you're no longer part of a wall of men in a field. You're part of a battlefield that is fractured, splintered, stretched. The line is still there, but it's unraveling. You imagine Napoleonic veterans raised on bayonet charges and column assaults standing bewildered at Gettysburg or Spotsylvania. The charge still happens, but it fails, more often cut down by accurate fire before it closes. Soldiers still fix bayonets, but fewer ever reach stabbing range. Historians still argue whether the bayonet became obsolete in this era, or whether it lingered as a psychological crutch. From your place in the smoke, it feels like a relic. The rifle also reshapes cavalry's fate once the terror of the battlefield horsemen now find themselves shredded long before they reach infantry lines. At Balaclava, the famous charge of the Light Brigade showed how devastating rifled fire could be. Brave men galloped into the Valley of Death Sabers, high only to be mown down by artillery and rifles before they could touch the enemy. Cavalry, once the predator, now feels like prey. The square, too, weakens. Once the perfect answer to cavalry, it becomes an easy target for rifles and artillery, a box of men standing still. Against long-range fire, it's a coffin. You feel the contradictions piling up, the tactics of the past colliding with the weapons of the present. The battlefield itself seems confused, caught between two ages. Quirky tidbits: some soldiers with rifles began to develop a kind of pride, almost snobbery, over smoothbore users. They called themselves sharpshooters, a word that entered English in this very era. Their accuracy gave them an identity even if the larger army still treated them as oddities. Imagine strutting around camp, boasting you could hit a target at 500 yards, while your comrades barely managed at 50. But pride turns hollow in the face of slaughter. You look across a field littered with blue and gray or red and white and realize the rifle doesn't just kill the enemy, it kills the line. It kills the very system you've been drilled into, the world of drums, flags, and shoulder-to-shoulder order. It makes discipline into death. And yet for all this, generals cling to the old ways. Maybe because they can't imagine alternatives. Maybe because mass armies still require structure. Maybe because the human mind clings to tradition even when bullets scream that the tradition is doomed. Historians still argue whether the line should have vanished earlier, whether the carnage of the Civil War could have been avoided by adapting faster. You know only this: standing with a rifle in your hands, exposed on an open field, you feel like a ghost waiting to fall. The rifled musket with its spinning minié ball doesn't just change battles, it changes war itself. It makes the world bigger, deadlier, lonelier. No longer do you fear only the cavalry's charge or the volley's thunder. Now you fear the unseen shooter hundreds of yards away, a faceless finger squeezing a trigger. The line you once trusted feels suddenly fragile, outdated, doomed. You trudge forward into another battlefield, but something feels different. The banners still wave, the drums still beat, and the officers still ride proudly with sabers drawn, but the air itself has changed. You're no longer fighting with smoothbore muskets that spit lead inaccurately at 50 yards. You're armed with rifles, and so is the enemy. The ground before you is already littered with men who never even reached the range where muskets would have once begun to bite. Welcome to the American Civil War, where the old habit of lines collides with the new reality of rifled firepower. At first, it feels the same. You stand shoulder to shoulder in a long formation, your boots dragging through dry fields or sticky mud. You hear the officer's sharp commands, and you raise your rifle musket in unison with hundreds of others. But when the volley roars, something horrifying happens. The enemy doesn't just flinch, they fall dozens at once, struck down at ranges that would have been unthinkable a generation earlier. You feel the same too when the return fire crashes into your ranks. Men collapse around you before you've even spotted the enemy's faces. Historians still argue whether Civil War generals were ignorant or simply desperate. Did they cling to line tactics because they didn't understand rifles, or because the sheer size of armies demanded order and visibility? The truth is muddled. Commanding tens of thousands of men still required rigid control flags and drums and formations visible through smoke. But the effect of rifle fire turned those same neat formations into slaughterhouses. You think of Antietam, 1862. The sunken road that later became known as Bloody Lane is seared into memory. Union troops marched again and again in lines against Confederate defenders armed with rifled muskets. Volley after volley mowed them down, piling corpses in the trench until it became a grisly barricade. You imagine standing in that lane, smoke choking, ears ringing, stepping over your fallen comrades as you fire into blue-coated ranks, advancing like waves against a seawall. The line didn't just hold, it bled, screamed, and yet somehow endured. Quirky tidbit soldiers often chewed bullets not for superstition but to steady their nerves. Mini balls were made of soft lead, malleable enough to bite. Chewing gave anxious men something to focus on before battle. Some even swallowed them, which later gave surgeons puzzled moments when X-raying veterans decades after the war, discovering bullets sitting harmlessly in their stomachs. At Fredericksburg, you feel the futility more than ever. Union soldiers, brave and disciplined, marched in perfect lines up Marie's Heights against Confederate riflemen entrenched behind a stone wall. Wave after wave advanced only to be cut down before they came within stabbing distance. You picture the horror, friends falling left and right, officers urging you on with drawn swords only to topple themselves in the hail of lead. Historians still debate whether this was a failure of imagination or simply proof that no army could unlearn old habits overnight. To you, trudging forward with rifle balls zipping past your head, it feels like madness. And yet, the line persists. Why? Because even in this age of rifles, discipline and unity matter. When soldiers panic and scatter, they're hunted down like rabbits. Only by holding together can men hope to advance, reload, and fire back with some coherence. The line gives courage, even if it also gives the enemy a target. The Battle of Gettysburg brings the paradox into sharp relief. On the first day, lines of Union and Confederate troops clash in open fields, trading volleys at ranges their fathers could never have imagined. On the second day, at places like the Wheat Field and Little Round Top, the terrain itself splinters the lines into fragments. Skirmishers and riflemen crawl through brush and rocks, fighting in ways that look more like the future than the past. By the third day during Pickett's charge, Confederate troops march in majestic lines across open ground, only to be annihilated by rifled fire and artillery long before they reach Union positions. Watching them fall, you understand the line isn't just fragile, now it's suicidal. Quirky fact, some soldiers in the Civil War believed in going to ground like animals, digging shallow pits with tin cups or even their bare hands to shield themselves from rifle fire. These improvised foxholes foreshadowed the trenches of the next Great War. Officers often curse them for disorder, but survival has its own logic. You imagine yourself clawing at the dirt, desperate for even a few inches of safety, knowing the old, straight-backed dignity of the line will get you killed. Still, the bayonet doesn't vanish. Charges continue, though fewer and bloodier. At Spotsylvania in 1864, men fought hand-to-hand along the muleshoe salient bayonets and rifle butts smashing in a rain-soaked trench. The line had crumbled into chaos, but discipline and desperation kept the fight going for hours. Historians still argue whether such battles were aberrations or inevitable, the last convulsions of an old system dying in the face of a new weapon. The Civil War also shows you something else: the importance of entrenchments. At Petersburg, armies dig vast networks of trenches, turning the battlefield into something that looks eerily like the Western Front of World War I decades later. The rifle has forced men into the earth. The line still exists, but now it's a line of dirt and wood, not men standing shoulder to shoulder. You realize you're witnessing the mutation of war itself. And through it all, the human cost becomes unbearable. Casualty lists stretch longer than any before. At Shiloh, Antietam, Chickamauga, tens of thousands fall in days, sometimes in hours. Families back home open newspapers and horror counting names. The neat lines that look so dignified on parade grounds have become conveyor belts to the grave. Quirky tidbit, despite the slaughter, some soldiers still insisted on polishing their brass buttons, whitening their belts, and marching with pride. They believed appearances mattered, even when appearance made them easier targets. Old habits of spectacle clung on the love of pageantry in the middle of mechanized death. You wipe sweat from your brow rifle, heavy in your aching arms. You no longer trust the line the way soldiers once did. It feels like a trap, a relic. And yet, you know why it lingers. In the chaos of war, discipline and unity are the only things that keep you from dissolving into panic. You stand in formation, heart pounding, even as every bullet shrieks that the age of the line is ending. The Civil War shows you the contradiction in its clearest form. The line is both essential and obsolete, both shield and target. It holds men together, but it also tears them apart. And as you stare across another bloody field, smoke thick in the air, you know the lesson technology has outrun tradition and war will never be the same. The battlefield shifts once more, and now you find yourself trudging not across American farmland, but through the mud-churned plains of Europe in the early 20th century. The air is thick with cordite, not black powder, and the thunder rolling across the horizon isn't the sound of massed volleys, but of machine guns rattling endlessly, stitching death into the earth. And yet, look closely, there are still lines. Not the old shoulder-to-shoulder ranks of bright uniforms, but long, stretched-out files of men in drab khaki or field gray, moving forward together, bayonets glinting faintly in the gloom. The echo of the line persists even as it becomes a relic. You march forward, rifle heavy pack digging into your shoulders. The officers still call for order, still try to marshal men into neat waves of attack. At the Somme in 1916, you watch lines of British soldiers climb from their trenches and walk slowly across no man's land, rifles shouldered as if on parade. They believe discipline and cohesion will keep them strong, that the lessons of the past still hold. But the reality is brutal machine gun fire scythes through the ranks before they've crossed even a fraction of the field. Whole companies vanish in minutes. Historians still argue whether those commanders were unimaginative or simply trapped by the logistical realities of the time. Coordinating hundreds of thousands of men across miles of front required structure. Radios where primitive chaos was constant, and the old idea of men moving together in visible formations seemed like the only way to maintain control. But against modern weapons, machine guns, quick-firing artillery, barbed wire, the line became little more than a conveyor belt into the grave. You think of Gallipoli, where troops advanced in orderly ranks up steep hills only to be shredded by entrenched Ottoman fire, or Tannenberg, where Russian infantry poured forward in massed waves, cut down by German machine guns and artillery long before they could even glimpse their enemy. You realize with sick clarity the line is no longer terrifying to face. It's tragic to behold. And yet, here you are, still part of one. The line hasn't vanished completely. The instinct for order is too strong, the need for cohesion too pressing. In some places, it mutates into creeping barrages where artillery fire advances like a moving curtain and infantry follows close behind step for step. In others, it fractures into fire and movement squads, small groups covering each other in bursts. But even then, the ghost of the line lingers. Men still dress ranks, still follow whistles, still advance together. A quirky tidbit: during World War I, soldiers joked bitterly about going over the top in lines so neat they might as well have been marching to a funeral procession. Some even polished their boots before attacks, a grim nod to tradition, as if spit-shined leather could shield them from machine gun bullets. One British officer reportedly told his men to button their tunics properly before an advance so they would look smart in death. Gallows humor, but also a window into how deeply old habits clung on. And still, there were moments when the line held meaning. At Verdun, French troops formed overlapping defensive lines, not shoulder to shoulder, but trench to trench, halting the German advance in a defense so stubborn it became legendary. At Ypres, lines of soldiers still countercharged through mud and gas bayonets, fixed fighting face to face in the old way when trench lines collapsed into chaos. Historians still debate whether these were echoes of past tactics or just desperation in the maelstrom of modern war. You can't forget the horror of new weapons that made the line obsolete. Machine guns cut swaths no volley ever could. Rifled artillery hurled shells for miles, killing men who never even saw their enemy. Poison gas drifted silently across the battlefield, seeping into trenches, breaking the discipline of even the tightest formations. You imagine yourself standing in a line when the gas rolls in, fumbling with a mask, coughing as comrades claw at their throats. No amount of order can save you from that. And yet, strangely, commanders still draw their maps with straight lines, arrows, and blocks of troops. The language of the line lingers long after the practice dies. Even when squads crawl forward in irregular bursts, even when trenches fragment the front, the idea of a line of battle remains the metaphor for war. You realize the line is not just a tactic, it's a mindset. Quirky fact: some WWI soldiers used the word going over in waves instead of lines, but the effect was the same. Men rose from trenches in long, staggered ranks, cresting like ripples of human surf. Letters from survivors often describe the sight as strangely beautiful rows of men advancing into dawn light until machine guns reduced it to grotesque ruin. Beauty and horror always hand in hand. You think too of how uniforms changed. Once bright and proud, designed to show off in line, they're now drab and muted khaki Feldgrau horizon blue. The line demanded spectacle visibility. The modern battlefield demands invisibility. The change feels symbolic, like war itself has shed its old pageantry and put on a shroud. Historians still argue whether World War I finally killed the line, or whether it had been dying since the first Minié-balls flew. Perhaps both. But as you crouch in a muddy trench rifle in hand, you know the truth. The line lingers stubborn and ghostly. It reappears in charges across no man's land, in defensive walls of bayonets, in the very language of war. And yet, every time it reappears, it dies a little more cut down by firepower that renders it absurd. You imagine one last advance whistle, shrieking men climbing ladders, rifles, clutched bayonets gleaming in the pale light. They form up instinctively, shoulder to shoulder. Though the trench walls make it awkward, they march forward, boots sinking in mud, and for a moment, it looks like a scene from the 18th century, a line of men advancing bravely into smoke. But then the machine guns open, the artillery roars, and within minutes, the neat formation is gone. The line persists into the 20th century, but now it's a ghost, an echo of discipline, and image commanders cling to a habit soldiers can't quite shake. You standing there in mud and fear understand the irony. The line that once saved lives now destroys them. And still, you hold your place, because the alternative chaos, panic, isolation is worse. The old thunder of volleys has become the endless rattle of machine guns. The neat ranks of musketeers have become waves of khaki trudging through barbed wire. The line isn't gone, it's transformed into something more tragic, more haunting, more futile. And as you shoulder your rifle, staring across no man's land, you know you're part of the last great echo of a tactic that once ruled the world. You stand in the quiet after a storm, and for the first time in what feels like centuries of marching through smoke and thunder, the lines dissolve in your memory. From the pike squares of the Renaissance through the thunderous volleys of the 18th century to the bloody fields of Gettysburg and the muddy trenches of the Somme, you've walked the length of an era. And now you ask yourself, why did these fragile lines endure for so long when their weaknesses were so obvious? Part of it, you realize, was discipline. Soldiers are human beings prone to panic, fear, and flight. Left to their own instincts, men scatter when danger comes. The line suppressed that instinct, binding thousands together into something greater than themselves. It turned fear into order, chaos into rhythm. You weren't just one man, you were part of a wall. That feeling, that belonging is powerful. Another reason is firepower. For centuries, muskets were inaccurate, clumsy, and slow. One man firing alone could barely hit anything. But 100 men firing together, that was devastating. The line concentrated weak weapons into overwhelming force. You weren't aiming at individuals, you were aiming at the idea of the enemy, at their line as a whole. And the more muskets you could bring to bear, the greater your chances of breaking them first. Historians still argue whether line tactics were more about psychology than lethality. Did the sight and sound of volleys matter more than the bullets themselves? Did the fear of bayonets matter more than the wounds they caused? Perhaps both. But either way, the line worked for its time. And cavalry always cavalry. For centuries, horsemen were the terror of the battlefield. They could outrun, outflank, and crush disordered troops. Only disciplined lines and squares could resist them. Without formation, infantry was nothing but meat before hooves and sabers. The line survived because cavalry demanded it. Quirky tidbit: in some armies, soldiers were trained to lock elbows in formation not just for show, but to prevent men from bolting when cavalry charged. Imagine clinging to your neighbor's arm so tightly that your fear of breaking formation outweighed your fear of the horse bearing down on you. It's absurd, almost comical, and yet it worked. The line also simplified command. In an age without radios or instant communication, how else could generals control thousands of men? Flags, drums, and bugles spoke only in broad strokes. The line gave shape to the chaos. A commander could see at a glance whether his army was holding or faltering. From a hilltop, lines were visible, comprehensible. Break them into scattered skirmishers and you lose sight, lose control, lose the battle. But weapons evolve, and with them, tactics. Rifles, artillery, and machine guns stretched the killing ground. Suddenly, standing shoulder to shoulder made you a target, not a wall. Cavalry lost its shock power. Cover became essential. The old reasons for the line withered one by one until only tradition held it together. And tradition is stubborn. Generals raised on the glory of past wars clung to what they knew. Soldiers drilled in neat formations found comfort in the ritual. Even when it killed them, the line gave structure, gave courage, gave identity. Old habits don't die easily, not in armies, not in human hearts. Historians still debate the exact moment the line truly died. Was it at Waterloo when rifles whispered of the future? Was it at Gettysburg when rifled muskets tore apart advancing columns? Was it at the Somme when machine guns erased neat ranks in minutes? Or did it die slowly, lingering as a ghost into World War I, a relic that refused to leave the stage until war itself became industrial and impersonal? From where you stand, having marched through these centuries, the answer feels less like a date and more like a mood. The line endured because it fit its world, its weapons, its fears, its commanders. And when the world changed, the line no longer fit. It shattered, leaving only echoes in the words we still use today. The front line, the firing line, the line of battle. The formation may be gone, but the metaphor remains etched into our language like powder burns on an old musket stock. A final quirky detail: in some armies, even after the line had become obsolete, soldiers still drilled for it in peacetime, practicing neat volleys for parades. It looked splendid, impressive to the public, a ghost of past glory. War had moved on, but the memory of the line lived on in ceremony. Perhaps it still does. You can see it today in military parades, soldiers marching shoulder to shoulder in perfect rhythm, bayonets gleaming under the sun. And so you exhale, musket or rifle heavy in your hands, and let the centuries fall away. The line was never immortal. It was a tool, a tactic. A habit born of necessity and killed by progress, fragile, rigid, terrifying, and yet astonishingly effective in its time. It lasted because it had to. It died because the world made it die. You close your eyes, hearing once more the rolling thunder of volleys, the crack of drums, the shriek of horses, the hiss of minié balls, the rattle, machine guns. All of it bound together by the same thread. Men standing shoulder to shoulder, hoping that unity might turn fear into strength. That was the promise of the line and its curse. And now at last the battlefield grows quiet, so you settle back, letting the images of smoke and steel fade. The line dissolves into mist, leaving behind only a memory of order and chaos. You picture yourself stepping away from the formation, loosening your grip on the musket, unclenching your jaw. The thunder recedes into a soft murmur like distant waves on a shore. The ground beneath your boots softens. No more mud, no more blood, just the cool hush of night air. You hear crickets instead of drums, a breeze instead of volleys. The discipline, the terror, the rigid geometry of war, all of it ebbs away. You're left with stillness and the gentle reminder that history, no matter how brutal, is behind you now. You breathe slowly. In through the nose, out through the mouth. Each exhale carries away the weight of centuries. The pike walls, the volleys, the squares, the trenches. They dissolve like smoke on a breeze. What remains is a calm sense of perspective. The line endured because men believed in it, because it was the best answer they had. It fell because new answers arose. Progress is like that. Old ways vanish, new ones arrive, and what once felt eternal becomes memory. You let that thought soothe you. Change is inevitable even in war, even in fear. And though the line is gone, its echo lingers in stories and parades and language. You've walked it tonight step by step, and now you can set it down. Close your eyes. Let the last musket smoke drift away. Let the clamor fade into silence. You're safe. The line is gone, and all that remains is the quiet hum of night. Sleep well.